Nehemiah, Resiliency in the 21st Century. The context of Nehemiah is about a character from the Bible that demonstrated a life full of resiliency. There's a lot to learn from his experience. His experience impacted his history, the history of Israel, and now impacts us today also. Nehemiah served in the Persian court as a king's cupbearer. He receives terrible news one day from what's happening back home. The temple was destroyed and people are away from God. The report he receives makes him very sad and leads him to take action. He prays to God for his divine intervention. In Nehemiah 1:6 in the New International Version, we read, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel." When he continues to allow his grief to show in front of the king. So first we see Nehemiah receiving bad news from what's happening back home. And the second thing we see is that he takes action by allowing his grief to show in front of the king. In Nehemiah 1:2 we read, "I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, 'Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?' This can be nothing but sadness of heart." In this action, Nehemiah is risking his life and his job in front of the king. So here we see Nehemiah beginning to take some action into his purpose and the purpose of Israel as a nation also. Let's go to the next slide. Nehemiah then returns to Jerusalem with the plan to rebuild. And also Nehemiah organizes the people to begin to rebuild the walls of Israel. So the king gave him the green light. He allowed him to go back to build the walls in Jerusalem. And Nehemiah makes plans and he gets there and he begins the work. Now here we see that this is part of the Jewish history because Nehemiah is actually planning and rebuilding and building the temple, which is part of Jewish culture. Next we see that in that Alexander in page 335 says the following: "People of all sorts join together in the work of rebuilding." So we see that Nehemiah organizes and everybody begins to work as one. But in the midst of this good work and building history for Jewish culture, we see that Nehemiah faces extreme opposition. Nonetheless, they have to face first ridicule, then terrorism from powerful opponents, said Alexander in page 336. So Nehemiah is beginning the work. Things are going well, but he faces extreme opposition. Things and people that are going against him. They're ridiculing him. There's terrorism, and there's powerful opponents. So here we see that only a resilient person could stand against this. Okay. Then Nehemiah defeats opposition. Nehemiah's reply is prayer and faith, plus practical action. We prayed and set a guard, said Alexander in page 336. He asked the people to build with one hand and hold their swords on the other hand. This is a proof of his resiliency. Hold your sword with one hand and build with the other. Here we see how he continued the work of building the walls of Jerusalem, impacting once again Jewish history, Israel's history. Then Nehemiah faces another problem. The rich Jews have been exacting interest from their fellow countrymen as slaves to foreigners. So we see that the rich people are taking advantage of the poor. This is a problem because God is trying to show Nehemiah that he cares about justice and mercy, and he cares about the poor. But then Nehemiah confronts this situation and fixes the problem, bringing back justice and love for the poor. Once again, impacting the history of Israel and his own and ours, as we will look at in a few slides later. After some time, Nehemiah finally finishes his project and demonstrates that he is resilient and that God is with him. Nehemiah will allow nothing deflect him from his God-given task, said Alexander in page 336. So he finished the walls, and we could see in this next slide. In this slide, we could see how fantastic it looks and how it's completed all around the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah was able to finish the work and impact his culture, history in his time and also in our times. Nehemiah then decides, Nehemiah dedicates the city walls. They met in the temple area for the concluding thanksgiving and sacrifices, proving that not only he had resiliency, but God was with him and he dedicated all to the Lord. So Nehemiah is not only a resilient man, but a grateful man. Finishing these walls meant that Jerusalem was protected from outside enemies. Finishing to build these walls meant that Israel was beginning a new period in their life. Now, this decisive moments in the life of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's life impacted Israel in a mighty way. He rebuilt the walls and brought unity in God's people. The life of Nehemiah turned when he decides to be resilient and do what no one else is doing, risking his life and future for the love of God, his city, and his people. Nehemiah's decisive moment happened when he decided to work for the Lord and change history in his time. Now, some of the lessons we can learn from Nehemiah. Number one, God moved when his people move in faith. God moves when his people move in faith. When God sees that his children begin to move in faith and begin to take action, he usually supports them. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to accomplish great things for the kingdom. Sometimes we don't have courage, but if we take courage just the way Nehemiah did and become resilient in the things we do for the Lord, that's all it takes sometimes to accomplish great things. Another lesson we can learn is that it's to build with one hand and hold the sword with the other. In the walk of God, his children need to have a balance in building God's kingdom and growing stronger spiritually to be able to defend themselves from the enemy. This is a spiritual principle that I can learn from the life of Nehemiah, and it is to hold your sword with one hand, protect yourself with one hand, and build with the other. In other words, have a balance in growing spiritually and also building the kingdom. Lastly, when we make God's priorities our priorities, we should expect his support and to become resilient. If we put God first, he will support us and we will become resilient. And this is the conclusion of this PowerPoint presentation about the life of Nehemiah and how he impacted the life of his times, the culture of Israel, the history of Israel, and our history now as well.